Hello there, and thank you for joining us today for this timely discussion. My name is Katie Duncan. I'm Head of Marketing and Communications for Asia Pacific at IDP Connect. On behalf of IEAA and IGP, thank you very much for joining us. We are absolutely delighted to have with us today colleagues from all around Australia, and in fact from all over the world, so a very warm welcome to you all. Before we go any further, I would like to acknowledge that I am hosting this webinar from the lands of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. While this is the last AIEC webinar for 2020, IEAA has two upcoming webinars this month. On Thursday, the 3rd of December, they will be hosting International Student Accommodation, Expansion, Quality and Recovery. And on Wednesday, the 9th of December, don't miss TNE Going Forward, Challenges and Opportunities. To find out more or to register, just visit the IAA website. The links will appear in the chat message shortly. As for AIEC, the team is now very focused on planning for AIEC on the Gold Coast next year. The new programme committee had its first meeting, and next week the new 2021 steering committee will be setting the theme and the direction for the year ahead. So make sure you save the dates, 5th to the 8th of October 2021. The team is determined to ensure that we all have an engaging experience, regardless of whether it's virtual or in person. So on behalf of IDP and IEAA, I would like to thank our sponsors and our partners for their continued support. To find out more, do follow us on social media or visit our website. And we also encourage you to sign up for the AIEC newsletter to receive updates and news for AIEC 2021. And I can see that most people are here now, so time for some quick housekeeping. This session is being illustrated by the brilliant Jessamy G. Illustrations and the video recording will be available on our website from tomorrow. There will be time for Q&A at the end, so please use the Q&A feature, not the chat. You should see the Q&A toolbox at the bottom of the top to submit your questions throughout. Our speakers might also be answering some during the sessions in writing, if you're lucky. To provide feedback on the session itself, please watch out for the poll at the end, and do also send us your comments via email. Now, let me introduce our speakers for today. We're very excited to have the Honourable Phil Honeywood joining us in between his media interviews today. Phil is Chief Executive of IEAA and he's joining from Melbourne, so a big welcome to Phil. It's such an important and uplifting week for Australia with the safe arrival into Darwin of our first international students since the pandemic. There's a National Council meeting in Parliament on Thursday. There is a lot going on. So Phil is going to give us the latest updates on the Secure Corridor pilot programmes, and there'll also be a chance to ask him your questions at the end, but please do submit those throughout as well. After Phil, we will hear from Jonah Duffin. Jonah is the Director of External Relations at IDP Connect, and he is joining us live and very early from London in the UK. Jonah will present findings from the third instalment of IDP Connect's International Student Applicant and Offer Holder Research, International Student Crossroads, which has been dominating the media headlines lately and helping inform university strategies and decision making. Finally, Phil will round up the presentations by talking to us about IEAA's 2020 Student Sentiment Survey, a landmark study across Australia and New Zealand of domestic and international students. So I'm absolutely delighted that we can end with a deep dive into the all-important student voice from both of our speakers. But first, let's get our sector update from Phil. So Phil, it's over to you.
Thank you, Katie. And of course, colleagues, we never want to revisit the year that's been, and we might just go straight to the first slide, I think. So latest figures show that USA, which despite Donald Trump is still the #1 study destination country in the world, is down 43% year on year. That's both online and on-campus enrolments. And I think we just lost the slides. Have we got the slides back there? Hello?
I think your slides are fine, Phil.
Okay, so
I can see those.
I just got to see my ugly face instead. So when it comes to the year-on-year performance, the UK is now looking at being 9% up in terms of the year-on-year, and also we've got a situation in which, because it's kept its borders open, notwithstanding the COVID pandemic, we've got a popularity situation happening there for study in the UK. Canada, I don't understand any loss of market share that's happened in Canada, and Australia is down approximately 25% year on year. We thought up until recently, but the IDP Connect data and also student application data, student visa application data for October year on year, which came out yesterday, indicates we're actually down 60%, would you believe, year on year for October in student visa applications. And that's quite dramatic, and we have to worry about that. So move on to the next slide. So then we look at competitive federalism, and who would have thought that the second tier of government, even though I was a state politician for 18 years, when I left state parliament, I thought, well, the federal government in Australia has taken over many of the powers and many of the policy areas that used to be in the control of our state governments in Australia. But what's happened with the COVID pandemic is really, it's allowed for federal government to, in many cases, put the blame, for want of a better expression, or put responsibility onto the state and territory governments when it comes to bringing international students and indeed Australian citizens back into our national borders. But in equal measure, the states and the territory governments have also played the blame game with the federal government. So it's really been quite frustrating for many of us to watch the different state and territory governments and the federal government shift responsibility according to their particular priorities throughout the year. So South Australia and Northern Territory obviously gained first mover advantage. We're delighted, as Katie said, to have 63 international students from mainland China, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Hong Kong come back to Australia and Darwin yesterday, and that was fantastic. But South Australia, of course, we're doing a lot of fantastic work to bring 300 students back, and because of their second wave of the pandemic, that's been now pushed back to January. We really admired the Premier of New South Wales, Gladys Berejiklian, in when the Prime Minister recently came out again and said that Australian citizens would have first priority over international students. To her credit, the New South Wales Premier said, hang on a moment, Sydney Airport is bringing in at least 75% of returning Australian citizens every week for the whole nation. And from January, we're calling that out, and we want 1/3 of our 3,000 a week returning flights to be overseas students. So that was fantastic call out by the New South Wales Premier. Queensland, Victoria, because of the massive lockdown in Victoria, we're still waiting for that Premier and the recent state election, the re-elected Premier in Queensland, to try and get their student return plans signed off and back to the federal government. And Tasmania and ACT, we thought we were going to make the 30th of November deadline for our Education Minister's student return plan requirements, but it turns out that they haven't done so yet. In Western Australia, well, we all know that Western Australia likes to think of itself sometimes as a different country. And in that regard, of course, the state premier there on a 91% popularity rating is not going to do anything quickly to reopen international education until after his state election in March. And that is a real shame, because iron ore prices are right up there, and Western Australia is quite happy to rely on its commodities, which is kind of unfortunate given all the hard work the universities and education providers in that state have done to really ramp up international education as a priority for the state's future. Next slide. And in all of this, I think what the pandemic's proven, colleagues, beyond a doubt, is that we need to really improve our social license to operate in the wider community. To that end, when it comes to the political community, we had a really great parliamentary friendship group inaugural event today. So IEAA has auspiced this first ever parliamentary friendship group involving 43 signed up senators and House of Representative members from all parties except Pauline Hanson's party, unsurprisingly. And that met today from 12:30 to 1:30 in a virtual lunch format. And we invited the key peak bodies in Australia, English Australia, Universities Australia, TAFE directors, our community college peak body, and the two private provider peak bodies all joined our President Janelle Chapman and myself in really educating parliamentarians more about the challenges and opportunities of our sector. Then, as Katie mentioned, this Thursday we have the annual meeting of the full Council for International Education, which has the 11 expert members. I have the honour to be the convener of that group, including, importantly, the elected national president of the Council for International Students, who has a full voting sort of voice at the table of that council, and our 6 federal cabinet ministers, chaired by our Federal Education Minister Dan Tehan, and our Foreign Affairs Minister, our Industry Minister, Immigration Minister, Trade Minister, and Science and Technology Minister. So I'll be meeting with all of them up at Parliament House Thursday morning. In that meeting, we're going to be putting forward the draft of our new international education strategy, which will have the theme of connected, creative and caring. We think they're apt words for what our sector does and aspires to do. And that will be a strategy that will take Australia forward from 2020 to 2030. It's not finalised. There'll be a draft, but then early in the new year, we're going to be doing face-to-face consultations across Australia. And then in all of that, of course, part of communicating to the wider community is really our wonderful Broaden Horizons website, which our association has populated with some fantastic video content and involves a great deal of research on community attitudes to the sector. And in that context, we've really been delighted to have the student voice research done by Rob Lawrence, and we're about to look at some of those initial unpublished results in my next segment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil, for this critical update. I feel like we could probably talk for hours about this, but we will get to the questions at the end. And well, congratulations to CDU. Just want to say congrats to the team there and to the Northern Territory government on the exciting step forward this week. And very proud of the team there for the care that they've shown students. IDP did play a small role, and obviously many other organisations have as well, but we just want to wish all the students the very best with their future studies and their quarantine, and look forward to welcoming more students back into Australia in the new year. So before I hand over to Jonah, just a reminder to please remember to submit your questions via the Q&A box. You can find that on the toolbar, either at the bottom or the top of your screen, and I will try to get to as many of these as possible at the end. Now we're going to speak to Jonah. He's going to share findings from IDP Connect's study International Student Crossroads 3. Jonah is joining us at the crack of dawn from the UK, so I'm not sure that the sun has even risen yet over there. So I'll hand over to you now, Jonah. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Casey. No, it's still pitch black here, I'm afraid. 6 o'clock, or just gone 6 o'clock in the morning. So I am going to give a very pacey run through of our latest International Student Crossroads, Crossroads 3. There's a lot to cover, so I'm, as I said, going to try and rattle through and pull out some of the key findings that I think will be of the most interest to this group. So if we start off with the next slide, I'll just quickly give you an overview of what I'm going to cover. I'm going to give a very, very brief overview of the first 2 Crossroads surveys that were carried out earlier this year during the pandemic, and then give a bit of a deeper dive into Crossroads 3, and then finish off with some of the key points from the findings, conclusions and recommendations. So on the next slide, we've just got a quick background of the survey. So we move on to that. We've got this, as I said, this is the 3rd iteration of the survey. It was a 12-minute survey with IDP applicants, offerees and current students and those who put their studies on hold or withdrawn. It was conducted between the 15th and the 6th of November, and I know that time these days is a strange concept, but just to remind people, this was prior to any of the recent vaccination announcements. So I think that's worth bearing in mind as we move through the survey. We had just over 5,000 students participate, and all of them had applied to one of the major English-speaking destination countries. So let's, as I said, move on to the next slide and have a look at what we learned from the previous surveys. So next slide, please. We've got a very brief recap. So really what we saw when we surveyed students back in April and in June was a growing acceptance of online. So from the first survey, students weren't too sure if they wanted to study online and transition to face-to-face, and we've seen progressively throughout the surveys a more pragmatic approach as they realise that that's the best way to fulfil their study ambitions. Then in the second survey, we introduced a question around quarantine, and we're surprised to see upwards of 70% likely to be accepting of quarantine rather than to defer in order to commence their study plans. And we saw them looking for both national governments and for universities and sector themselves to make certain commitments and to be able to support them in things such as healthcare, accommodation, travel support, and other areas. But I think one of the most important factors that we saw emerging from the first two surveys was a real difference in the way in which Indian and, in general, South Asian students are approaching the pandemic and their study ambitions over those from China. So Indian students much more likely to want to arrive on campus, to travel during the pandemic and to commence their studies, where we saw a bit more caution from Chinese students in terms of health and safety, and in terms of looking at deferring rather than fulfilling their study ambitions, or starting online and in their home country, and then when safe to do so, moving to their study destination. So real difference between those two different markets. And if we move on to the next slide, we can see how that played out in reality. So this is IDP enrolment and finalisation data for the UK, which was open to receiving international students throughout September and October. And what we see is what we saw in those surveys of those Indian and South Asian students are much more likely to want to come and arrive on campus, and the Chinese students to stay at home and start online. We see that in reality with 85% of South Asian students arriving in the UK and only 15% commencing offshore online, whereas almost the direct reverse for Chinese students, with only 22% arriving here in the UK and 78% studying online. I think so it's showing the validity of the research we did earlier in the year, and it's also giving you some real insight there into the actual behaviour of students, not just surveying. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So let's have a look at the findings for Crossroads 3. So quickly look at the respondents on the next slide, just so people have an idea of who we were surveying. So it really represents as a whole IDP's operating cadence and where we operate and where we dominate. So huge number of Indian students, just over 3,000, and then an increasing number of Chinese students for the latest survey. Australia was the largest destination market, but we had good responses from all of the other major destination markets of Canada, UK, US, and New Zealand. So if we move on to the next slide, please, then you will see the status of the students when they filled out the survey. So we had nearly 60% of offer holders, and then some pending offers, 15% current international students, and then we had that 15% segment there at the bottom that's circled, or sorry, squared in the red box, and those who have either chosen to study in their home country or put their studies on hold or withdraw. And what we see is that the reason for them not proceeding with their previous study ambitions is really a pragmatic approach around an uncertainty whether they'd be able to leave their home country due to the travel bans, or to a slightly lesser extent that they don't feel safe to travel and arrive in the destination country. So the two major factors preventing them or stopping them from studying were those practical, pragmatic approaches, and then we see a long tail of other aspects, much more around pedagogy and learning. So whether they wanted to take blended learning, couldn't afford tuition fees, and difficulty getting a visa being some of them. So if we move on to the next slide, then we will see again in a little bit more detail that it was really that uncertainty around travel bans, but it really differs to a certain extent on the country, and again a theme that we're going to see throughout the research. So Australia at 44%, whereas UK and US respectively at 18 and 16%. So this is showing that students understand what is happening within the countries in terms of travel policies, and are recognising that it'd be very difficult to travel to Australia at the moment, much easier to travel to the UK and the US. Then we also see as well that they recognise the level of infection. So seeing that a third are saying that they don't feel safe to travel to the UK, and 29% to the US, whereas that's much lower for Australia and New Zealand, where obviously there have been lower or no cases for quite some time. So those are the really key findings that I wanted to pick out in terms of those students who have put their studies on hold or suspended their studies. And if we move on to the next slide, then we then asked them whether they were likely to want to study internationally within the next 2 years. So would they reignite their want to study abroad? And what we see is that really encouragingly, we've got 74% who are saying yes, they are very likely to do so. But I think again worth pointing out that this differs greatly between the key source countries. So India, that increases slightly to 75%, whereas for China we've got almost a quarter and over a fifth saying that they're not likely to. We've got 40% in the middle grey undecided category, and only 37% saying that they're very likely to do so. So that begins to allow us to look forward and see what the next 2 to 3 years are going to be like, and whether we're going to develop latent demand. So how do applicants perceive the destination countries? I think this is something we've asked in all the surveys and is really fascinating. So what we've got down the left hand side is we've got 6 different factors, from response to coronavirus, safety of citizens and visitors, welfare of international students, economic stability of the nation, travel restriction policies, and post-study work visa. And I think for the majority of people on the call who are from Australia and New Zealand, we see really positive perceptions. New Zealand often out in front, and then Australia neck and neck in many cases, or slightly behind or slightly ahead Canada. So really positive in terms of overall perceptions. But if I draw your attention down to the second from bottom row, you will see travel restriction policies, where you see the UK and the US out in front. So perceptions of those travel policies are more positive for the UK and US. And I think that's important, because if we go on to the next slide, we can now begin to see a trend in terms of how those perceptions of the different countries have shifted between the last 3 surveys. And what we see is that whilst Australia and New Zealand remain having positive sentiment in the majority of areas, if we take this one, response to coronavirus, we see that actually Australia has seen a decrease in positive perceptions between the survey in June and the latest survey in October, and the same for New Zealand as well. However, for the UK and US, which are open to receiving students, we're seeing an increase in positive sentiment between June and October. So I think it's quite difficult for people to, when you look at this initially, to understand what's happening here. But my take very much is that students are looking at it from an individualistic point of view. A response to the coronavirus by a nation is not necessarily the number of infections that they have, but is actually how they've responded in terms of facilitating or not that individual respondent's ability to come and fulfill their study goals and study internationally. So I think that's something really important for all countries involved in international student recruitment to bear in mind, that students are looking at it in terms of their ability to study overseas. If we move on to the next slide, please, then what are applicants planning to do? So if we move on here, then this is looking at whether students are expecting to start their studies as planned. And we start on the left with the April survey and move through to the right to the latest October survey. And we see that there's been a significant increase over the course of the 3 surveys in the number of students expecting to commence their studies. So now we have a very positive 80% of students who are expecting to start their studies as planned. But if we go on to the next slide, we'll see again that we've got differentiation depending on the different destination markets and on their policies of being able to accept students onto campus and into the country. So for the UK and the US, who are on the right-hand side, the 2 right-hand columns, we see that that expectation has increased between the 2 surveys. So 82% for the UK, 86% for the US. However, for New Zealand, that's actually declined to 72%, and for Australia we're seeing a much smaller increase, so it's only at 74%. So again, students recognizing some of the barriers that face them at the moment, and seeing that the expectations are lower for New Zealand and Australia, so for the Southern Hemisphere, than for the Northern Hemisphere, which is much more open at the moment to receiving those students. We can then slice that data in one further way on the next slide, which is looking at that same data, but now looking at it for globally for India and for China. And we see that for India, it's at 83% of students are stating that they expect to start their studies as planned, but it's only 2/3 for China. So again, we're seeing that theme that we've seen throughout all of the research, that Indian students have a much higher expectation and are much more ambitious in terms of fulfilling their study plans, with more caution from China, and that continues in this latest survey. We're then going to look at whether we can convert those students into commencement on the next slide. So if we have a look, this is really referring to how the education is delivered. And what we see is a real increase over the course of the 3 surveys in students' acceptance of starting online and then transitioning later in the course to face-to-face. So that's gone up every survey from 31% in April to now standing at 43% in October. We see no real change in those who are wishing to defer and wait for face-to-face. Where we're seeing a decrease is in undecided. So I think we can point to students having more information, both from universities and from nations, but also more information in the general news media, which allows them to make decisions. So interesting and important that students are increasingly looking to transition to face-to-face, but are willing to study online in larger numbers. But again, we can look at that data in a slightly different way and see the differences that there are between the different source countries. So if you move on to the next slide, then you can see that again there's that difference between South Asia and China. So on the top left hand side of your screen, you see India, and you see a large dark grey segment of the pie, and that is students who are wishing to defer entry to study face-to-face. Then if you look at China, just to the right of that, you'll see a much smaller dark grey section of the pie, and a larger yellow section, and the yellow represents students who wish to start online but transition to face-to-face. And you see a real difference between those different countries. So in India, it's again, it's that idea that they want to come onto campus, they want to have that study experience, they want to study face to face, and will wait to do so, or possibly will change destination country. Whereas for China, much more open willingness to start in their home country, where believe they see it as safer, and then to transition to face-to-face when safe and available to do so. So seeing very different angles and very different approaches from those two major source countries. So we move on to the next slide. So how likely are you to change your destination? So what's your loyalty to the destination that you've originally applied for? And would you be more likely to switch to a different destination country if you were able to get that face-to-face teaching earlier? That was the question that we asked. You'll see that those in orange, the larger the orange bar, the less likely they are to change. So they're much more loyal to their original destination of choice. Yellow, they're likely to change. The red or the green arrows show the difference between the last survey. And what we see is overall 45% of students are unlikely to change, but that's dropped. And we've seen a 3% increase to 32% of students who are likely to change in order to seek face-to-face teaching if it happens to be opening up earlier somewhere else. And we see for Australia, we see a 2% drop in that loyalty, and actually a 4% increase. So up to a third of students now was stated in this survey that they would be willing to change destination, excuse me, to gain that face-to-face teaching earlier. So there could be a real shift in students from one destination to another in order to gain that such important on-campus experience. So if we move on to the next slide, then you can begin to see where they would move to. And I think what's really interesting for Australia is you've got over 50% are considering other countries, with Canada being very much the most preferred destination. But actually they're also looking internally. So there's internal competition within Australia, with 43% stating that they would look at other universities within Australia if they could get that face-to-face teaching earlier. It's a similar picture for New Zealand, with 41% looking within New Zealand for other universities if they could get face-to-face earlier, and just under 60% again considering other countries, with Canada out in front, and Australia in second place with 16%. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So we then asked students whether they would prefer to quarantine or whether they would defer to avoid quarantine. And we saw a very significant change from the June survey to the October survey. So it's gone from 75% who said they would quarantine, which was a large number in itself, and is now at 90%. So 90% of students willing to quarantine rather than defer. The 10% who said that they would prefer to defer than quarantine. The reasons were around financial cost as the main one at 65%, but then also looking at their more health and mental health, we're looking at the effects on that and their social life as well. So we've also got on the right hand side there, it's split by different countries, and again that theme throughout. So Indian students much more likely to wish to quarantine rather than defer, up at 93%, and China down at 74% with Indonesia. So again, that South Asia split can be seen in the willingness to quarantine, but overall students very much pragmatic in their approach and seeing the safety measures in place, and very much willing to do so in order to gain that on-campus face-to-face experience. We then asked a question that was unique to those who were studying in Australia. So if we move on to the next slide, this is just looking at those who have Australia as their study destination, and it looks at whether they were willing to pay the whole cost of quarantine or wanted to have at least part of it subsidised. And what you'll see that in total, just over a fifth were willing to pay the full cost, but the vast majority were looking at either having some of it subsidised, or just under a fifth saying that they were not willing to pay for quarantine at all. And again, not to wish to repeat myself too much, there is some difference between the key source countries there, with Indian students 57% willing to pay a portion of the costs, but actually for Chinese students that increases quite significantly by another 10% to 67%, saying they were willing to pay a portion of the costs, but obviously expecting others to pick up the other portion of the costs of quarantine. So that was a really quick run through the data. So I'll just finish off with some key points and recommendations and then hand back to Katie. So on the final slide, I think overall a real resolve by students to continue their studies. They're pragmatic, they're willing to quarantine, they're willing to start online or have blended delivery before transitioning to face-to-face. But there is a perception that both Australia and New Zealand could begin to lose students to other destinations that are open because there is that real want for face-to-face on-campus teaching, and students are increasingly likely to switch if they can gain that face-to-face teaching earlier. So there is some perception challenges as the borders remain closed within the Southern Hemisphere. We've seen that real increase in students wishing to commence, really hold on to their ambitions and want to follow through with commencing their studies. And I think just finally, more than half of the current students who commenced in the second half of 2020 are expecting to transition to on-campus learning by early next year. So that's data that we haven't included in the survey, but worth recognising that as students start on their journey, and if they are starting online, they do want to transition to face-to-face as quickly as possible. That was a very, very quick run through. I think I'm just about in on time. I'm happy to answer questions in the chat, but thank you very much for listening, and I hope you found that useful.
Wow, thank you, Jonah. A lot to take in there, and we have got some questions for you at the end. Very encouraging to see the growing ambitions of students to continue with their studies. A few perception challenges for the Southern Hemisphere. So I know there are a lot of institutions on the webinar and also some policymakers out there who will be listening intently. So now it's time to hear from Phil again, and this time Phil is going to take us through some of the results of the 2020 Student Sentiments Research that IEAA and Education New Zealand have recently conducted. So Phil, it's over to you.
Thank you again, Katie, and it's really important, I think, to note that this is the first time we've done collaborative research with our Kiwi cousins. I shouldn't say Kiwi competitors, our Kiwi cousins, and clearly New Zealand and Australia, based on what Joan has just really very professionally put forward, are in similar situations, given that we're obviously paying a price for our COVID-safe dividend that we would like to be able to really leverage off, but because we're locked down, we're actually, our sector's losing by it. So this is the background, colleagues, to the research that we've put forward, and Rob Lawrence has done a great job. We're publishing this early next year, but this is really a first taste, if you like, of where we're at so far. We might just move the slide. Acknowledging those universities and TAFEs for really getting behind this survey of around 4,000 students, both domestic students in New Zealand and Australia and international students. And you'll see there our New Zealand colleagues so far have included University of Auckland, Canterbury University, to name a couple there. And we've got more who've signed on since then. All right, on to the early findings. Thank you. Next slide. So obviously, learning employability skills was top priority for students, particularly relevant workplace skills, course related. And this is the priorities really from the domestic students. Interesting enough, living on campus didn't rate as high as some of the other ones, and many of us thought that living on campus sort of experience would have been seen as far more desirable, particularly in the COVID pandemic period. And it's been interesting to note that, you know, making new friends, access to support services and so on are clearly very important. Next slide. So from the Australian and the New Zealand domestic students' perspective, these were the greatest challenges that Rob Lawrence's survey and research has been able to provide. And it's quite interesting that these findings are quite different, if you like, from the key concerns and challenges that international students, you'll see in a moment, have identified. So remaining motivated, and maintaining grades, studying in isolation, transition to online studies have all been really key features. And I have to say, living as I do in a residential college, my wife's the head of at University of Melbourne, these issues really, the top 4 there and 5 really, social isolation, really resonated with my experience of 300 international domestic students here on campus this year. Having said that, of course, we have to think, well, is it partly because international students are very resilient in being prepared to move from another country, different culture, and all the issues that go with that? Is there a resilience amongst international students that may not have been coming to the fore amongst our domestic students during the pandemic? And interesting to note, the accommodation difficulties was the lowest of those concerns and challenges. And again, you have to wonder, was that because our domestic students moved back home to family? Was it because they had no eviction policies in place in some state governments here in Australia? Interesting to flesh that out later. Next slide. So awareness levels amongst Australian and New Zealand domestic students of the challenges faced by our international students in both countries. And again, not much of a variance there, you'll see, but actually quite reassuring that, ironically, it's taken a pandemic for our domestic populations, not so much students, but I guess many adults, in terms of their awareness of the plight of international students. Now, you know, our national TV news bulletins have shown international students queued up at food centres and welfare providers to try and survive in many cases. And it's interesting, of course, that in Australia, international students could not access welfare support, such as welfare programs such as job seeker allowances. In New Zealand, I understand that they were able to for quite some time, but it's interesting, we can't quite ascertain any difference there at this point. Next slide. So apart from awareness, the next issue was really about levels of concern. And again, as part of our desire, IEA, to really ensure that we have a handle on the social license to operate for international education, this was important for us to realise. And 89% of Australian students are concerned about the challenges that our international students face. And again, that doesn't vary greatly between our two countries, but it's good to know that on the one hand, they're more aware, on the other hand, they are genuinely concerned. Next slide. And for many of you, this will be an important point to be made, and that's trusted sources of information. We've discovered that really the international students look to the website of their university or education provider. They go to their student services, and this is actually broken down in slides I can't show today, where we found that students from the subcontinent, Nepal and India, were far more motivated to access their student services by their education provider compared to Chinese students. The Australian government website should be happy that they're wanted, needed, and hopefully loved. I think there's a bit of a rationale there for why the New Zealand equivalent is so low in terms of accessing government websites, because you look down there and you'll see the Education New Zealand, my website is quite separate, obviously, from their government website, and that is obviously quite popular as well. And you'll see the different ones there in terms of agents, and good to see the IEA website is somewhat popular as well. Next slide. So positive impressions of Australia and New Zealand, and positive being 5 to 7 on the scales that we've used, and interesting there that, of course, we still benefit both countries from being, open, transparent societies, from being supporters of cultural diversity and multicultural policy settings, and for being friendly countries. Again, our Kiwi cousins can probably take heart from the fact that they seem to have slightly the edge over Australia, but they love to have the edge over Australia, so we'll let them have that one. And but good to see that our image offshore is still very good indeed compared to some of our other study destination competitor nations. Next slide. These are what we call positive outcomes rankings, and the circle there really highlights some of the differences between international students, Australians with permanent residency and Australian citizens. And you'll see that positive rankings of what we have really resonates with, this is just for Australians, in this case, not New Zealanders, really resonates with Australians. Appreciation of family, you'd expect to see that as being high amongst international students, but good to see that the Aussies also have fallen back in love with their families. And I think it's really interesting to learning to study online. That's clearly been a massive issue for international students. And I think we have to acknowledge that that would really be because so many of them have had to learn to study online offshore, whereas their Australian counterparts have probably been more relaxed about learning to study online because they're in Australia and they probably feel like they've got more backup potential there. Obviously, learning to take one day at a time is an interesting one, and the building of resilience as well. But nothing startling there other than to say that our international students, we've circled that one in the middle, they want friendship and kindness. They hopefully are getting more of that, particularly from their domestic student counterparts that we saw in previous slides. And friendship and kindness rank higher for them than it does for Australian citizens and Australian permanent residents. We'll move on. And this is the final data slide that I can show colleagues before we publish this full data set early in the new year. And these slides have been gleaned from 75 slides that Rob Lawrence has provided to IEA already. I think some of the key points of difference there, it comes back to that first slide really that I've showed, which around future employment and lack of part-time work. So you'll see quite a massive difference there in the middle. The lack of part-time work hasn't been such a big issue for Australians, hasn't been such a big issue for New Zealanders, but for international students, and as we know, particularly from the subcontinent, when we drill down, we'll find that they have really been affected by the lack of part-time job opportunities. The future employment prospects, the key motivator for studying in another country, obviously the key concern, surprising in a way that Australian citizens and New Zealand citizens aren't as concerned about their future employment prospects. And they're, again, back to that crucial employability issue, they're the main issues that our international students have really felt the hardest and the most difficult. And obviously, access to an on-campus community has also been one that has been more important for them than just not a great deal more, but more than Australian and New Zealand domestic students. So I think there's some really interesting issues to come out of that. Interesting also that limited ways to make new friends has been far more important to Australians and to New Zealanders than to the international students. And that might be because they've, in many cases, they're either stuck in their home country and therefore their friendship group has become more important to them in their home country, or they're already here in Australia, those that got through before lockdown, and they've already had their friendship groups established perhaps as well. In all of that, inability to study is clearly crucial to each cohort, because we often overlook the fact that many Australian and New Zealand citizens now, domestic students, now look for a learning abroad opportunity, which has been denied them, and we've had to pivot to virtual internationalisation, field work and virtual study abroad opportunities. I think that really is the presentation that we can give to date. Thank you. Oh, sorry, we've got some conclusions there that we put together for you, which I think really, colleagues, I've already highlighted as well. And I think, yes, that's just to really sum up some of the points that I've already made around key points of difference between overseas students and domestic students. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Phil. Incredibly rich insights there. So I'm waiting in anticipation for that report in the new year. It is, in all seriousness, it's very important to understand the challenges for our international students and how that's being perceived. So obviously a lot of work for us to be doing, but great to see Australia and New Zealand especially leading the way with this, and that you've commissioned this work. So great job there to the team. And also want to mention, you touched on something as well. Our thoughts are with the international students affected by hardship. A lot of them have lost their jobs, as you mentioned, and don't have any job seeker support in Australia. So our thoughts are with the vulnerable groups. And I know there's a lot of good work going on, but obviously a lot more to do still. So now, as promised, we have some time to answer your questions. I'm going to try to get through as many as possible, and you can in fact still submit them via the Q&A button. Just a heads up that you'll see the poll popping up shortly too, so please do provide feedback on how you found the session today so that we can improve. So I think my first question is going to be for Jonah. Learning to study online was seen as a positive for international students in Phil's research. So I'm just interested to know, Jonah, if anything in the Crossroads research came up about current student experiences around learning online. It would be good to know what they rate as going well for them, what are the challenges, and I'm not sure if you have any data on that you're able to share with us.
Yes, thank you, Katie. Apologies, I don't seem to be able to turn my video back on, but hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly.
Great. So we did include current students in the survey, but I didn't include it in this presentation due to time constraints. It was 15% of the just over 5,000 respondents were current students, and overwhelmingly they were positive about their study experiences so far. The majority were obviously studying in Canada and the UK, and I think it was around about 80% felt that they had their expectations met and were happy with their decision to commence their studies during the pandemic. There was some real variation amongst all of the different destination countries as to the level of support that they had received. It was UK students who had received the most support in terms of some of the practical issues around quarantine, so supply of food and supply of accommodation during quarantine, but also some of the more pastoral measures such as support with their physical and mental health during quarantine. But yes, for that small 15% who filled it in, really positive about their decision to commence their studies, and a real, I think, compliment to all of the universities around the world and sectors that have worked so incredibly hard over the last 6 to 8 months to ensure that their staff and their students are safe and still able to learn during this time. So they were really positive part of the findings.
That's great to hear. Thank you, Jonah. Over to Phil now. I'm not sure if he is around and able to speak to us. I was interested to know from your research what you think that the two countries, Australia and New Zealand, or perhaps particularly Australia, can learn from New Zealand. What can institutions practically be doing, and what is your advice on how we bridge the gaps that you mentioned in awareness levels?
Katie, I have a strong view that the competitive federalism I noted in one of my early slides has been a real downside to Australia's all the wonderful work done by our sector. That New Zealand, as we often know, is able to go offshore, speak as one country, as one education system. We find with our school sector, for example, that New Zealand's got 20% of their international student enrolments are in their school sector. In Australia, it's only 3%. And a large part of the reason for that is that when Australia goes offshore, we promote 8 separate matriculation certificates that all compete against one another without one national school certificate that the Kiwis have. So I think some of the learnings are that, for example, New Zealand's immigration department and its education department really work hand in glove and promote international education as a public good, as a community good for New Zealand's future. In our situation, we have the Education Department of Australia, which does promote international education, but our Home Affairs Immigration Department equivalent tends to be a bit like the computer that just says no, unfortunately, and acts often as a barrier rather than as a facilitator of support for our sector time and time again. As well as that, I think we'd have to agree that New Zealand came forward under their Prime Minister with a very compassionate and a very unified hardship program, which included, of course, access to welfare programs, at least initially. I'm not sure where that's at now. Whereas in Australia, we gave mixed messages that there was a pool of money from the federal government here, different funds from different state governments, accommodation support from New South Wales government versus cash vouchers, food vouchers from the Victorian government. And the message that went forward offshore was really that we were not really speaking with one voice, and we didn't have a comprehensive, understandable program in place. So I think that, combined with messages from our political leaders, really are lessons that we've learned from our New Zealand Trans-Tasman colleagues, and we can only hope that we can emulate some of their success there.
Thank you, Phil. That brings me on to my next question, actually. So obviously, with a lack of an enforceable national strategy and an approach, how does this impact student destination choice within Australia? Is there a plan to look at this? Will you be looking at this in the new strategy that you mentioned, the 2020 to 2030? Connected, creative and caring strategy, will that be looked at? And I'd also like to know, Phil, your view on what the sector needs to do to speak with that united voice that New Zealand, as you mentioned, does so well, and we know Canada does too.
Well, of course, in Melbourne, Victoria, where I am based, we had one of the world's longest lockdowns, Katie. I think we came out of it a couple of weeks ago, absolutely sort of worn out, and but we're COVID free now, so that's great. What happened, of course, was that quite appropriately, many of our international students in states such as Victoria decided to vote with their feet and get out of the state before the major lockdown. And we've heard anecdotally about some universities and education providers in Queensland, New South Wales, being the beneficiary of international students transferring within state borders or across state borders to some of their institutions. So obviously, again, to my point of the unfortunate competitive federalism that's been operating during the pandemic, we've got a situation in which international students will, and education agents who, of course, such as IDP, who send more than 80% of full fee pay international students to Australia, education agents, we're looking at states that are more open. We thought South Australia would have a inside mover advantage there, but now they've had to push their first pilot program back to January. So we're hoping that clearly it's one nation, we can really promote the same messages, but the way it's looking, certain states, particularly New South Wales, will be able to really promote return of international students before others, and whether that will give them first mover advantage is yet to be seen. So, yeah, I mean, it's just a vexed issue, the way in which our federal system with state governments competing against one another. And in WA, as I said, their premier is showing no interest until after his state election in March in really opening up. And we think that's a shame, and we're just hoping that we can effectively lobby the WA government to be more realistic about international students' return.
Thank you, Phil. I'm interested as well to ask you, what is the sentiment within Cabinet and key ministries towards returning students in small scale or large scale? So you mentioned New South Wales. I'm over in New South Wales, and obviously the Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, she's very ambitious about bringing large numbers of international students back. I wondered if you have any insight on their view on the scale of these pilots.
You really do need to have a roadmap or a mud map, really, of who's who in the zoo. And of course, it can be a zoo from time to time. So, of course, what we find in the New South Wales Cabinet is our champion ministers for international education are the Treasurer, Dominic Perrichet, the Skills Minister, Jeff Lee, but crucially, Stuart Ayres, who's responsible for hotel quarantine. And of course, Stuart Ayres is the lifetime partner of our Federal Foreign Affairs Minister, Maurice Payne. So, yeah, I mean, and Stuart Ayres actually came out of study group before he became a politician. So New South Wales ministers seem to be much more attuned to our sector. The member of Study New South Wales board, I'm very much aware of that. In Queensland, they've just appointed a new champion minister for international education, Sterling Hinchcliffe, and we're looking forward to working with him as Queensland comes out of its re-election stupor. And in Victoria, we're really working hard to really find a champion minister, because I think in Victoria we've sort of let the ball down, so to speak, with no state strategy having been renewed since June and no funding envelope there for quite some time until the recent state budget. So, yeah, we're very keen to ensure that each state has a champion minister who can then also advocate with us to the federal government and to our champion minister, Dan Tehan, within the federal cabinet.
Thank you, Phil. Great to hear from the ears of the ministers there. Just back to Jonah now. I'm trying to understand where you think that Australia and New Zealand might sit in the global competitive landscape that you and Phil have both been referring to. So firstly, I'd like to know if you think that Australia and New Zealand are at a disadvantage with a February intake for the next academic year. And I'm also interested to know, we've had a few questions asking about the timing of the survey, because we understand that since the survey was out in the field, that we've had quite severe lockdowns in the UK, restrictions in the US. Obviously, we've had the president and vice president-elect in the US. Do you see any change in the perceptions? What's your predictions for the next 6 months?
Thanks, Katie. I don't think I'm going to make any solid predictions, but if I take the first half of your question around whether there's a disadvantage from a February start, in a way, I don't really believe so. I think the Northern Hemisphere had intakes earlier in the year and had to make decisions about those intakes for September, October, in the midst of the first wave of the pandemic here in the UK and in the US and Canada, and then begin to welcome those students into the country as we started a second wave of infections. So in some respects, I think it's given Australia and New Zealand a little bit of breathing space and slightly longer to prepare. But I say that slightly hesitantly, because it's so hard to prepare in a time when things are changing so quickly and you don't really know what context or external environment you're necessarily always preparing for. But I think as we begin to get more positive news on the development of vaccinations, I think the Southern Hemisphere is really well placed to create a clear strategy so that students can possibly commence online and then subsequently move to face-to-face teaching as fingers crossed, touch wood, those vaccination programs begin to take effect later in 2021. So I think there has been certainly significant increases in the number of institutions in the UK who are putting on early 2021 starts. It wasn't really a big start date for the UK, but this year there's some major institutions that have quite ambitious programs and targets for that. So I think, having said that, I think Australia's not at a disadvantage. It's certainly more competitive point in the year than it previously has been. Then in terms of the second half of your question, really around looking at what's going to happen next, the timing of the survey showed that was, yes, before Biden's re-election. Looking at some of our real-time data, you can see that there's a small gradual return of interest to the US, both in the 2 weeks before his election and in the time afterwards. So that will be an interesting one to watch. But I think overall we've seen real fluctuation like we've never seen before this year in terms of student interest at the top of the funnel when they're inquiring across the digital space across all of our websites. So I think it really depends on policy and on the ability for students to see that roadmap into university, and then possibly starting online and then transitioning to face-to-face.
Thank you so much, Jonah. It's going to be an interesting few months, and yeah, we'll see how that plays out next year. So we've got time for just one or two more questions. So another one for you, and I'm going to ask the same question to Phil. We obviously have a lot of Australian and New Zealand education providers on the webinar today. What can they do to communicate their eagerness to have international students return? You know, realistically, what should they be doing while overseas borders remain closed? What advice do you have for them?
Is that to me, Katie?
Yeah, sorry to you, Jonah.
Sorry. I think the first thing to say is that, you know, I think largely, and looking over from the UK, they've done a brilliant job in communicating what in an extremely complex environment and a changing and challenging time both for institutions and for the students themselves. You know, it's been a really, really challenging year, one that we've not seen before. I think what our research really shows is that students are looking for clear, factual information and pragmatic advice, and understand when we don't necessarily always know the answers to everything, but they want that honesty and they want to understand, as I said before, what the roadmap is to them being able to achieve their ambitions. So I think it's really about showing students that we're listening and giving them those honest and quick responses to some of their questions and their needs and wants, so that they have the information available to them so they can plan what's really right for them.
Thank you, Jonah. And I want to ask a similar question to Phil. So in Australia, we're all very grateful for the work that IAA is doing to lobby, and obviously CISA and many other groups. I wondered if you have any advice for institutions other than to be patient. What's your sort of practical advice at this time about what they can be doing to support you?
I think really, Katie, they have to become far more vocal with local members of parliament. One of the key challenges we face in Australia is that most of our public universities are located in inner city electorates, where often the local member is not a member in government, you know, particularly in the Labor electorates. So that often means that they don't feel as though they've got as much political leverage on their local members as what they would have if their particular seat in parliament was in a government electorate. But we have to do far more to educate both the political community and the wider Australian community about, you know, 240,000 Australians work in the sector, not IEA figures. That's our Education Minister Dan Tehan's figure, $40 billion a year. But far more importantly, it's going to have to be about the soft power diplomacy benefits. Now, what we've really tried to do as an association in the last 6 months is really focus on the media outlets that really are not about talking to ourselves. So whilst it's fantastic that I get a regular run advocating for the sector in the Australian newspaper, often the people that read the Australian newspaper are those that really already know about us. So what we've tried to do is I've done 4 drive time radio interviews with Melbourne radio station 3AW, and done a couple with 2GB in Sydney. We've really tried to get into the Herald Sun newspaper, the Adelaide Advertiser, the Brisbane Courier Mail, and Sydney Telegraph. Really tried to, if you like, focus on the media that would appeal to Australian community members who are not necessarily those that would work in our sector, or those that perhaps are more educated, so to speak, about what our sector stands for. So, you know, that's got to be part of it. But our institutions really do need to find ways and means, both through media, through public relations, professional programs, to also sing from the same hymn sheet, if you like, and really advocate about the benefits, not just financial, but in soft power terms, that we're providing to the future of Australia.
Thank you, Phil. Very powerful vision there, and it reminds me of the Bernard Salt webinar, for those who caught that, the AIC webinar we had with Bernard Salt, talking about some kind of community level campaign and really working with those media outlets so that we're not always speaking to ourselves, and getting the community involved as well. So we are just about out of time, unfortunately, and thank you. I know I could probably talk about this for hours. I know we've still got a lot of people on the line, but we are unfortunately going to have to wrap up. And this does conclude our AIC Connect webinar series for 2020. We are thrilled that so many of you could join us today, and hope that you're feeling much more informed going into the new year. Of course, a very special thanks to our speakers, to Phil and Jonah, for sharing some encouraging news and insights. I think we're all ready to embrace the new year with positivity and new ideas, despite the inevitable challenges. So we look forward to seeing you in 2021, and we would like to thank you for all your support during this challenging year. Until then, please do take good care of yourselves and have a safe and restful break. Thanks very much. Bye-bye for now.